The late summer sun cast long shadows across the dried riverbed as Matthew Harris traced his fingers over weathered tracks in the mud. At 62, his joints protested the crouch, but decades of hunting men had taught him to read sign like others read books. These tracks told a story he didn't much like. Cavalry horses, maybe 15 of them, moving fast and purposeful 3 days ago. Behind them, scattered prints of fleeing Apache, including small feet that could only belong to women and children. Matthew straightened slowly, his worn leather duster creaking as he surveyed the desolate landscape around the Rio Grande's western tributary. 20 years ago, this had been a bustling trade route between Santa Fe and the Southern Territories. Now it was a no-man's land of broken treaties and broken bodies. The bounty hunter adjusted the Winchester rifle slung across his back, its wood smooth from decades of use. The air carried the metallic tang of smoke from somewhere upstream, along with something else, the sickly sweet smell that always followed death. Matthew had been tracking a bank robber named John Young out of Virginia City, but that pursuit would have to wait. Something about those small footprints nagged at his conscience, a part of himself he thought he'd buried years ago along with his family. As he followed the trail north, Matthew reflected on how the land had changed. The trading posts that once dotted these banks had been abandoned as the railroad pushed west, leaving behind only sun-bleached timber and rusted mining equipment. Even the mighty river had withdrawn, leaving cracked mudflats that stretched for hundreds of yards between the scrubby banks. The scene that greeted him around the next bend confirmed his worst fears. Bodies lay scattered across a small camp, mostly women and elderly, their forms already beginning to bloat in the merciless sun. Matthew had seen plenty of death in his years, but this was different. This wasn't combat, it was slaughter. As he moved through the camp, his boots leaving prints in dried blood, he heard something that made him freeze, a child's whimper. Behind an overturned cooking pot, he found her. A girl no more than 7, clothes torn and dirty but otherwise unharmed. Her dark eyes watched him with a mixture of terror and defiance as she clutched a crude wooden doll to her chest. Matthew knew enough Apache words to attempt communication, but she remained silent, pressing herself further into the shadows when he approached. "Name's Matthew," he said softly in English, crouching down several feet away. "I ain't gonna hurt you, little one." He pulled a piece of jerky from his coat pocket and held it out, not moving closer. The girl's eyes darted between his face and the offered food as the minutes stretched out. Finally, hunger won over fear, and she inched forward to snatch the jerky before retreating to her hiding spot. As she ate, Matthew surveyed the camp more carefully. Something wasn't right about this massacre. The cavalry tracks showed them circling multiple times, methodical rather than chaotic. They'd been searching for something specific. Near one of the bodies, he found scattered papers bearing Army letterhead, the text filled with strings of numbers and medical terminology he didn't understand. A glint of metal caught his eye, and Matthew extracted a small brass tag from the mud. The letters were partially obscured, but he could make out Project Dreamwalker and what looked like coordinates. He'd heard whispers of strange experiments being conducted on native peoples, but had dismissed them as campfire tales. Now he wasn't so sure. The girl had crept closer while he examined the tag, her curiosity seemingly overcoming her fear. She pointed at the metal and spoke her first words. "Bad medicine," Matthew nodded slowly. "Reckon you're right about that, little one." He tucked the tag into his pocket and stood. Decision made. The bank robber could wait. He had a new quarry to hunt and a child to protect. Dawn found them moving steadily north along the river's edge. The girl perched on Matthew's horse while he walked alongside, leading the animal over the uncertain ground. He'd managed to learn that her name was Hannah, though whether that was her real name or one given by missionaries, he couldn't tell. She spoke a mix of Apache and broken English, enough to communicate basic needs. The cavalry's trail was easy to follow. They weren't trying to hide their passage. Too many hoof prints for a standard patrol, and they were maintaining a formation even while traveling. Matthew had served briefly during the war, and this precision spoke of a special unit, one operating under direct orders. The question was, orders from whom and for what purpose? By midday, the sun beat mercilessly upon them as Matthew spotted smoke rising from a bend in the river ahead. He guided the horse off the trail and into a grove of cottonwoods, helping Hannah down before tethering the animal. The girl's dark eyes followed his movements as he retrieved his Winchester from its scabbard. "Stay quiet," he whispered, receiving a solemn nod in return. Moving through the underbrush, Matthew's weathered boots made no sound on the soft earth. Years of tracking men across unforgiving terrain had taught him the value of patience and stealth. As he approached the source of the smoke, the acrid smell of burned canvas and leather filled his nostrils. This wasn't a campfire. This was destruction. The riverside trading post came into view, or what remained of it. The modest wooden structure was still standing, but its contents had been dragged outside and put to the torch. Matthew studied the scene carefully from his concealed position. Fresh horse tracks, military issue, circled the building. Several sets of boots had moved with purpose through the yard, searching for something specific. Inside the ransacked trading post, Matthew found scattered papers bearing official army letterheads, but the text had been carefully burned away. A leather-bound ledger caught his eye, partially hidden beneath an overturned desk. The most recent entries detailed unusual supply requisitions, medical equipment, chemical compounds, items that had no business in a frontier trading post. Hannah appeared in the doorway despite his instructions to stay hidden, her small frame silhouetted against the bright day outside. She pointed to a symbol scratched into the doorframe, a medicine wheel with unfamiliar markings. "Bad spirits here," she said, backing away. "Like where they took others." Matthew's jaw tightened. The cavalry wasn't just attacking random Apache camps. They were following a pattern. The sound of approaching horses sent them both scrambling for cover behind the counter. 4 riders appeared, led by a man whose bearing screamed military despite his civilian clothes. They dismounted efficiently, weapons ready. "Check inside," the leader ordered. "If Andrew's notes are here, find them. Burn anything else." Matthew recognized the clipped accent of an East Coast education. This was no frontier officer. Hannah pressed against Matthew's side, trembling but silent. He could take maybe 2 of them before the others returned fire. But the odds weren't good. The girl's safety had to come first. As boots approached their hiding spot, Matthew prepared to move. A sudden commotion outside provided the distraction they needed. Shouts about Apache riders spotted to the north. The men rushed out, mounting quickly and galloping away. Matthew waited several long minutes before moving, making sure it wasn't a trick. Hannah tugged his sleeve and pointed to a trapdoor partially hidden by scattered merchandise. Below, they found a small cellar containing several crates marked with Army medical insignia. Inside one were glass vials filled with cloudy liquid, carefully packed in straw. "Best leave those be," Matthew muttered, but quickly sketched the strange markings on the crates into his notebook. The cavalry's interest in this trading post and their systematic raids on Apache camps were connected. Something sinister was happening along this stretch of river, something that powerful men wanted to keep secret. They emerged to find the day waning, long shadows stretching across the yard. Matthew led Hannah back to where they'd left the horse, his mind working through the implications of what they'd discovered. The girl's people weren't just victims of random violence. They were being targeted for some larger purpose, and now that same purpose had nearly trapped them both. Setting up camp that night in a sheltered canyon well away from the river, Matthew studied his maps by firelight. If the cavalry was operating out of Fort Amarillo as he suspected, they'd need a secure location for whatever experiments they were conducting, somewhere isolated but accessible by river. His finger traced a tributary leading into Apache territory, stopping at an abandoned mission he'd passed once years ago. Hannah sat across the fire, watching him with eyes that held too much knowledge for her young age. She'd drawn symbols in the dirt matching the ones from the trading post, medicine wheels and strange glyphs that made Matthew's skin crawl. Whatever darkness they were pursuing, it had left its mark on this child. He silently renewed his promise to see her safely home, no matter the cost. As dawn broke over the canyon walls, Matthew rolled his maps and tucked them into his saddlebag, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. The morning air carried an unseasonal chill, and wisps of fog clung to the rocky ground like ghostly fingers. Hannah had already started breaking camp, her small frame moving with the fluid grace of her people. In the few days they'd traveled together, she'd proven herself far more capable than most twice her age. The old bounty hunter's mind kept returning to the mission marked on his maps. San Miguel de los Apaches, abandoned during the Mexican War and forgotten by most. But its position near the confluence of two rivers made it ideal for clandestine operations, close enough to Fort Amarillo for supply runs, yet remote enough to hide whatever darkness the cavalry was pursuing. He'd heard whispers in Virginia City about government men in black coats asking strange questions about native healing practices. The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly as Matthew Harris guided his horse along the muddy banks of the Rio Grande, the young Apache girl clinging silently to his worn leather vest. 3 days had passed since he'd found her hiding beneath the charred remains of an army supply wagon, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Though he'd spent 20 years tracking outlaws across the frontier, something about this child's plight had stirred long-dormant emotions in his weathered heart. Trading posts and ramshackle settlements dotted the riverbank ahead, their weathered wooden structures casting long shadows across the murky waters. The girl, who still hadn't spoken a word, tensed as they approached the bustling riverside community of Laredo. Matthew knew the risks of bringing a native child into town, but his supplies were running dangerously low, and he needed information about recent Apache movements in the territory. The trading post run by John Wright stood like a fortress above the river landing, its high walls decorated with stretched animal hides and strings of dried peppers. As Matthew dismounted and helped the girl down, he noticed several cavalrymen lounging in the shade of the wooden awning. Their pristine blue uniforms seemed oddly out of place this far from any major fort, and their presence set his instincts on edge. Inside the post, the air hung heavy with the smell of tobacco and leather. John Wright's weathered face creased into a frown as Matthew entered with the Apache girl. "Dangerous times to be traveling with that kind," the trader muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the door. "Army's been through here regular past month, asking strange questions about the tribes. Something ain't right about it neither." Matthew learned that most of the local Apache had vanished from their usual hunting grounds weeks ago. Those few who remained spoke of mysterious illnesses striking their camps and soldiers taking away the sick under cover of darkness. The girl trembled as Wright described the symptoms: violent fevers, bleeding from the eyes, victims going mad before death claimed them. It was unlike any natural disease the old trader had ever encountered. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the grimy window, Matthew watched as more soldiers arrived, led by a stern-faced officer who introduced himself to the lounging men as Major David Young. The girl's grip on Matthew's arm tightened painfully as she recognized something about the officer's bearing or uniform. Her first words, since he'd found her, came as a whispered warning in broken English: "Bad medicine, man." That night, sheltered in an abandoned river barge, Matthew pieced together fragments of the girl's halting story. Her people had been healthy and strong until the soldiers came with their special medicine. Those who refused to drink the offered water sickened anyway. She had watched her mother, Grace, collapse in convulsions before the soldiers dragged her away. The girl had escaped during the chaos, hiding until Matthew found her. Dawn brought the sound of hoofbeats. Matthew peered through gaps in the barge's rotting planks to see Major Young leading a patrol along the riverbank. The officer carried himself with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. But there was something else in his bearing, an almost fanatical intensity that sent a chill down Matthew's spine despite the morning heat. In the days that followed, Matthew and the girl shadowed the patrol at a safe distance, watching as they visited isolated homesteads and trading posts. At each stop, Young consulted a leather-bound journal and collected water samples from wells and streams. The girl recognized markers her people used to identify safe water sources, markers the major seemed to know about as well. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made Matthew's blood run cold. They made camp that evening in a hidden canyon, and Matthew found himself studying the girl's face in the firelight. She reminded him of his own daughter, lost along with his wife to cholera 15 years ago. He had turned to bounty hunting afterward, numbing his grief with the pursuit of wanted men. But now, confronted with this child's suffering and the Army's apparent betrayal of everything he'd once believed in, old wounds began to heal even as new ones formed. The next morning brought more revelations. While scouting ahead, Matthew encountered a half-delirious Apache brave who had escaped from what he called the death camp, a hidden facility where soldiers and doctors performed horrible experiments on captured natives. The brave's fevered ramblings spoke of strange equipment, men in protective suits, and tests designed to measure how different tribes responded to various diseases. He died before sunrise, his body racked with the same symptoms John Wright had described: A chance encounter with a sympathetic Army scout named Michael Lewis confirmed their worst fears. The military was indeed conducting secret tests, officially sanctioned at the highest levels. The goal was to develop weapons that could be used to solve the Indian problem once and for all. Lewis had been documenting the program in secret, hoping to expose it, but wasn't sure who he could trust with such explosive information. As Matthew and the girl continued their journey upriver, signs of the Army's handiwork became impossible to ignore. Abandoned Apache camps stood silent and empty, their inhabitants either dead or taken to the mysterious facility. Those few natives they encountered were sick or dying, their bodies ravaged by artificially enhanced diseases. The girl's quiet grief turned to anger as she recognized more and more familiar faces among the dead. They took shelter one night in a cave overlooking the river, and Matthew found himself making a decision that would change both their lives forever. He could no longer simply return the girl to what remained of her people, not when doing so might condemn her to become another test subject in Young's twisted experiments. They would have to find a way to stop the program and expose the truth, even if it meant becoming fugitives themselves. As dawn broke over the river valley, Matthew and the girl made their way down from the cave, following game trails that would keep them hidden from Army patrols. He had decided their best chance lay in reaching Virginia City, where he had an old contact named David who worked as a newspaper editor. If anyone could help expose Young's operation while keeping them safe, it would be David, who had built a reputation for fearlessly publishing stories that powerful men wanted buried. The girl, who Matthew had started calling Grace after she drew symbols in the dirt that reminded him of his long-departed sister's graceful handwriting, proved remarkably adept at spotting signs of pursuit. Her keen eyes caught the glint of brass buttons through the trees more than once, allowing them to avoid the cavalry scouts who seemed to be sweeping the area with increasing frequency. At a bend in the river, they discovered a half-sunken trading boat, its cargo of supplies still partially intact. Matthew salvaged what he could: ammunition, dried meat, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal that had belonged to the boat's captain. Its water-stained pages contained detailed notes about Army supply movements to a restricted facility upriver, along with troubling observations about sick natives being transported under heavy guard. They spent 3 days moving cautiously northward, staying close to the water but well hidden in the thick riverside vegetation. Grace's condition improved steadily with proper food and rest, though the haunted look never quite left her eyes. She began teaching Matthew basic Apache words and hand signals, building a bridge between their worlds, even as circumstances forced them closer together. Near an abandoned river landing, they encountered an elderly trapper named Andrew, who shared disturbing news over a careful campfire. He'd seen Army wagons moving at night, carrying covered loads that moaned like the dying. The cargo was bound for a newly constructed stockade near Santa Fe, where strange smells and sounds emanated at all hours. Andrew had lost 2 friends who'd gotten too curious about the facility. They'd simply disappeared without a trace. The information helped Matthew piece together a larger pattern. Young wasn't just experimenting on captured Apaches. He was testing his weapons across multiple sites, using the vast distances between frontier settlements to hide the scope of his operation. The treatments that had killed Grace's people were likely just the beginning of something far worse. Their journey was interrupted when they stumbled upon a massacre site, not Apache this time, but a white settler family. The bodies showed signs of the same devastating illness that had ravaged the native camps, suggesting Young's pathogens didn't discriminate between victims. Matthew found military shell casings nearby, indicating the Army had tried to contain the outbreak. He and Grace buried the dead as best they could before moving on with even greater urgency. As they approached the outskirts of Virginia City, Matthew noticed more frequent military patrols and checkpoints on the main roads. Someone had clearly spread word about them. He would have to be extremely careful making contact with David, as the newspaper office would likely be watched. Grace suggested using the extensive network of mines beneath the city. Her people had known about them long before the settlers arrived and had mapped many hidden entrances. The stakes became devastatingly clear when they observed a military convoy from a hilltop overlooking the river. Among the prisoners being transported was a face Matthew recognized: Victoria, a nurse who had helped treat his wounds after a gunfight years ago. She had been working at frontier clinics recently, which meant she must have learned something about Young's program. Her capture confirmed his worst fears about how far the Army would go to keep their secret. That night, as they camped in a sheltered ravine, Matthew taught Grace to use his spare revolver. He had avoided it before, clinging to some notion of preserving her innocence, but circumstances had forced his hand. She took to the weapon with the same quiet determination she showed in everything else, and he saw in her eyes the same steel he'd recognized in other survivors of profound trauma. They were no longer simply fugitives. They were becoming soldiers in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. The river seemed to mock Matthew Harris as he crouched behind a fallen cottonwood, his weathered hand gripping the old Sharps rifle. The Apache girl, who he'd taken to calling Hannah, though she never spoke her true name, huddled beside him as they watched the military encampment across the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. The sound of suffering drifted across. Her people, what remained of them, were being held in makeshift pens near the water's edge. But it was the strange equipment and mysterious glass vials that troubled Matthew most, glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. Through his brass spyglass, he could make out Dr. Michael Wright moving between the Apache prisoners, methodically injecting them with something that made them writhe in agony. The doctor's pristine white coat seemed obscene against the dusty backdrop of the frontier outpost. Two soldiers flanked him, rifles ready should any of the test subjects attempt resistance. Matthew had tracked them for 3 weeks since discovering the massacre site, following the trail of bodies and strange blue-tinged blood. Hannah tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a figure being dragged from one of the holding pens, an elderly medicine man whose face was contorted in a way that seemed barely human. His skin had taken on an unnatural gray pallor, and his movements were erratic, almost bestial. Matthew felt his stomach turn as he realized what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary military operation. They were using the Apache as test subjects for something that defied explanation. Captain John Young emerged from the command tent, his pristine uniform a stark contrast to the suffering around him. Matthew had known Young years ago during the war, before the man's ambition had twisted him into something unrecognizable. Now he stood watching the experiments with cold satisfaction, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. The river lapped at the shore below him, carrying the echoes of pain downstream toward Santa Fe. "We have to move tonight," Matthew whispered to Hannah, who nodded with grim understanding beyond her years. They had watched long enough to know the patrol patterns, the weaknesses in the perimeter. But it was the strange metal containers being unloaded from supply wagons that worried him most. Whatever was happening here went far beyond the usual brutality of the frontier. This was something new, something that shouldn't exist in this or any other world. As dusk approached, more wagons arrived bearing the seal of the Virginia City Mining Company. Matthew recognized Andrew Lewis supervising the unloading, a man he'd once trusted before learning of his involvement in this grotesque enterprise. The mining company was clearly more than a simple business venture. It was providing cover for whatever ungodly experiments were being conducted here on the river's edge. The pieces were finally falling into place. Hannah's small hand found his in the growing darkness, and Matthew felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. He had tried to stay uninvolved, to simply return this child to her people, but fate had other plans, forcing him to confront a horror that threatened not just the Apache, but the very soul of the frontier itself. The old bounty hunter knew that by sunrise, blood would stain these waters red. Under cover of night, they moved silently along the riverbank, using the sound of the water to mask their approach. Matthew's joints protested the careful crawl through mud and reeds, but years of tracking had taught him patience. Hannah moved like a shadow beside him, her young eyes sharp in the darkness. They reached the first pen just as the moon emerged from behind thick clouds, illuminating the twisted faces of the prisoners within. The lock yielded to Matthew's skilled hands, but the prisoners seemed hesitant to move, their eyes glazed and movements uncertain. Something had been done to them, something that left them changed in ways that made his skin crawl. Hannah whispered to them in Apache, urgent and low, until finally they began to stir. Matthew counted 12 survivors, less than half showing signs of the strange transformation he'd witnessed earlier. A shout from the guard's tower shattered the night silence. Gunfire erupted, bullets kicking up dirt around them as Matthew returned fire with his Sharps. Hannah led the prisoners toward the river while he provided cover, his shots finding marks in the darkness. But it was the inhuman screech from behind that chilled his blood. The transformed medicine man had broken free, charging the guards with impossible strength and savage fury. Chaos erupted across the camp as more of the transformed Apache broke free, their mutations seemingly accelerated by the stress and violence. Captain Young emerged from his tent shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by screams as his own experiments turned against him. Dr. Wright fled toward the supply wagons, clutching his precious research journals, only to be caught by creatures that had once been his test subjects. Matthew grabbed Hannah and ran for the river as explosions rocked the compound, the mysterious containers rupturing in the mayhem, releasing clouds of strange-colored vapor into the night air. They splashed into the cold water alongside the surviving Apache, the current carrying them away from the nightmare behind them. The last thing Matthew saw before the bend in the river was the camp consumed in otherworldly flames, Captain Young's screams echoing across the water. Dawn found them miles downstream, huddled in a sheltered cove as Matthew tended to the survivors. Half had been infected with whatever hellish concoction Wright had created, but Hannah seemed to know ancient remedies that helped ease their suffering. As the sun rose over the river, Matthew realized that some stories of the frontier would never be told in dime novels or around campfires. Some horrors were better left to sink beneath the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. The following days saw them making their way toward Laredo, moving only at night to avoid military patrols. The infected slowly recovered under Hannah's care, though their eyes held shadows of their ordeal. Matthew knew they had witnessed something that would change the frontier forever. Proof that man's capacity for cruelty went far beyond simple greed or revenge. The old bounty hunter had found something far darker than any evil he'd tracked before. As they approached the outskirts of Laredo, Matthew noticed increased military activity along the river. Patrols had doubled, and strange lights flickered from a newly constructed fortress-like building on the American side. Hannah's people had always spoken of spirits dancing in the night sky, but these ghostly illuminations carried the cold precision of man's handiwork. The survivors huddled closer together as they moved through the darkness, their breaths shallow with fear of discovery. In a hidden grove of cottonwoods, Matthew met with Andrew, a sympathetic trader he'd known from his bounty hunting days. The man's face grew ashen as Matthew revealed what they'd witnessed upstream. "There's more," Andrew whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Army's been bringing in strange equipment, chemicals. Heard talk of other facilities being built near Santa Fe and Amarillo. Whatever happened at Wright's camp wasn't isolated." Hannah approached them silently, her dark eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. She placed a small leather pouch in Matthew's weathered hands. Inside were seeds from plants her people had used for generations. "Medicine," she explained softly, "but in wrong hands, poison." Matthew understood then why Wright had been so interested in Apache remedies. The military wasn't just experimenting on the tribes, they were stealing their ancient knowledge for weapons. The decision weighed heavily on Matthew's conscience. He'd spent decades tracking men for gold, but now faced a threat no bounty could resolve. The survivors needed safe passage to Mexican territory, yet he couldn't abandon the other tribes to Wright's successors. Hannah seemed to read his thoughts, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Some fights choose us," she said in carefully practiced English, "like river choosing its path." Under cover of a storm, they split into two groups. Grace, one of the recovered survivors, would lead the others south, while Matthew, Hannah, and 3 warriors who'd regained their strength headed north toward Amarillo. The old bounty hunter had contacts throughout the territory, men who'd help expose Wright's operation if given proof. But first, they needed to document the other facilities. Lightning illuminated the tearful goodbyes as the groups parted ways. Matthew watched Grace disappear into the rain, leading her people toward hoped-for sanctuary. He'd given her his prized Winchester and enough gold to bribe any officials they encountered. Now, turning north with Hannah at his side, he felt lighter despite the dangerous path ahead. For the first time since finding the girl, he wasn't acting from mere duty or guilt. The journey to Amarillo tested them severely. Twice they nearly stumbled into military patrols, saved only by Hannah's uncanny ability to read the landscape. The warriors, proud men who'd once viewed Matthew with suspicion, now accepted his guidance through the white man's territory. Together they gathered evidence: shipping manifests, photographs taken with a stolen camera, testimonies from sympathetic workers who'd fled the program in horror. But it was in an abandoned church outside Amarillo that they found their most damning proof. Hidden beneath rotting floorboards were Wright's personal journals, detailing the entire operation with cold, scientific precision. The military hadn't just been experimenting with weapons. They'd been trying to harness and control the spiritual powers of the tribes themselves. The writings revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of forces that Hannah's people had learned to respect over countless generations. Matthew knew the journals alone wouldn't be enough. The public might be outraged by stories of experiments on tribes, but the military would simply deny everything. They needed to demonstrate the consequences of tampering with powers beyond their comprehension. Hannah's knowledge of her people's medicines would be crucial, not as weapons, but as protection against what they might encounter. As they prepared to infiltrate the Amarillo facility, Matthew watched Hannah grinding herbs by firelight. She'd grown stronger during their journey, no longer the frightened girl he'd found months ago. The other warriors treated her with deep respect, recognizing that she carried the wisdom of their ancestors. Whatever happened in the days ahead, Matthew realized his role had changed too. He wasn't just a bounty hunter anymore, but a defender of something far more precious than gold or territory. Matthew Harris crouched behind a fallen log, his weathered hands gripping the old Henry rifle as he watched the military compound through his spyglass. The Apache girl, who he'd come to know as Grace, huddled silently beside him. Over their weeks of travel together, she'd shown him horrors he never thought possible. Secret camps where soldiers conducted twisted experiments on native prisoners under the guise of civilizing them. His bounty hunting days seemed like another lifetime now. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley where Virginia City's outskirts met the winding river. Supply wagons rolled regularly between the town and the military installation, carrying mysterious crates marked with symbols he'd never seen before. Through careful observation, Matthew had identified the man in charge, Colonel John Wright, whose pristine uniform and rigid posture couldn't mask the coldness in his eyes. Rebecca Lewis, the widow who ran the trading post by the river, had become their only ally. She secretly provided them information about the compound's operations while maintaining her cover as a simple merchant. Matthew had noticed how her hands trembled whenever the soldiers came to resupply, how she'd learned to avert her eyes from what was loaded onto their wagons. She knew more than she was willing to say. David Young, a cavalry deserter Matthew had encountered in Santa Fe, had warned him about Wright's operation. "They're testing something on them," he'd whispered, terror evident in his voice. "Something that changes people. I've seen men go in whole and come out different." Matthew had dismissed it as the ravings of a broken man, but now he knew better. The evidence was in the haunted eyes of the few Apache who'd escaped. The military's official story was that they were containing a mysterious illness among the native populations. But Matthew had seen the laboratory equipment, the strange instruments, the detailed records of subjects and trials. They were using the Apache as test subjects for something far more sinister, attempting to alter their very nature through means that defied comprehension. Andrew King, a sympathetic doctor in Amarillo, had examined one of the escaped test subjects. His medical report, secretly passed to Matthew, detailed disturbing physical changes, heightened aggression, enhanced strength, but also rapid deterioration of mental faculties. The military wasn't trying to civilize the natives. They were trying to weaponize them. Grace's people hadn't simply been decimated by conventional warfare. They'd been systematically rounded up for these experiments. The few survivors were held in underground cells beneath the compound, subjected to daily injections and observations. Through Grace's broken English and sign language, Matthew had learned that her father, the tribe's medicine man, was among them. Victoria Wright, the colonel's wife, had unwittingly revealed crucial information during her visits to Rebecca's trading post. Her casual mentions of shipment schedules and security rotations had helped Matthew piece together the compound's vulnerabilities. The colonel's obsession with his work had driven a wedge between them, and her loose tongue was born of bitterness and wine. Under cover of darkness, Matthew and Grace made their way toward the compound's rear entrance, where Michael Harris, Matthew's estranged brother and a junior officer in Wright's command, had promised to meet them. The brothers' reunion after 15 years had been tense, but Michael's conscience wouldn't allow him to remain silent about the atrocities he'd witnessed. The plan was simple but dangerous. Michael would create a distraction while Matthew and Grace freed the prisoners. But as they approached the rendezvous point, gunfire erupted from the guardhouses. Michael's body lay crumpled by the gate, his warning dying on his lips. Colonel Wright had known they were coming. There was a traitor in their midst. In the chaos that followed, Matthew discovered the terrible truth. Rebecca Lewis had been forced to betray them. The military held her daughter, Hannah, as insurance against her cooperation. The experiment's true purpose was even darker than they'd imagined, not just to create weapons, but to perfect a method of complete human subjugation. The firefight that ensued would be remembered in Virginia City for generations. Matthew's years of bounty hunting served him well as he and Grace fought their way through the compound. They found her father, barely recognizable after weeks of experimentation, leading the other test subjects in a desperate bid for freedom. The horror of what had been done to them was matched only by their determination to escape. Colonel Wright's death came not from Matthew's gun, but from his own test subjects. Their enhanced strength turned against their tormentor. As the compound burned, Matthew led the survivors to the river, where sympathetic traders helped them disappear into the territory. The military would record it as a tragic accident, an explosion in their medical facility. But the truth would live on in whispered stories. Grace and her remaining people found sanctuary with a peaceful tribe near Laredo, far from the reach of military experiments. Matthew stayed with them for a time, helping them heal and rebuild. He never returned to bounty hunting, having found a different purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The land dispute that had initially displaced Grace's people faded into memory, overshadowed by the darker truth they'd uncovered. Years later, Matthew would hear rumors of similar experiments in other territories, but he had done what he could to expose the truth. The river trade routes that had once carried supplies for Wright's twisted science now carried warnings between native tribes, creating an underground network of resistance. The frontier had changed them all, but not in the way the military had intended. As winter settled over the borderlands, Matthew found himself adjusting to a different kind of life among Grace's people. The river valleys near Laredo offered shelter from both the harsh weather and prying eyes, while the surrounding hills provided natural lookout points. He spent his days teaching younger tribal members how to spot military scouts and distinguish friendly traders from those who might pose a threat, passing on the skills he'd honed over decades of tracking. Grace emerged as a strong voice among the combined tribes, bridging the gap between traditional ways and the harsh new realities they faced. She never forgot the horrors they'd witnessed at the military facility, but rather than let it break her spirit, she channeled that knowledge into building a network of allies. Through careful negotiations with sympathetic traders along the river routes, she established safe passages and warning systems that would help protect other tribes from similar threats. In Virginia City, rumors circulated about the mysterious explosion that had destroyed the military's medical research operation. A young journalist named Hannah began asking uncomfortable questions, piecing together fragments of truth from whispered conversations in saloons and trading posts. Matthew occasionally sent her coded messages through trusted riverboat captains, helping to ensure the full story wouldn't be buried by official denials. The surviving children from Grace's tribe, once test subjects in Wright's twisted experiments, slowly began to heal. Some showed unusual abilities, heightened senses, or inexplicable knowledge of things they couldn't have learned. But their new community protected them fiercely. Matthew often watched them playing along the riverbank, their laughter a reminder of why he'd chosen this path over his former solitary existence. As spring approached, word reached them of similar facilities being constructed near Santa Fe. Grace and Matthew made the difficult decision to send scouts to investigate, knowing they couldn't stand idle while others faced the same fate. They recruited trusted allies among the river traders, establishing a chain of safe houses and escape routes that stretched from Amarillo to the Mexican border. The military's official story began to unravel when several officers, haunted by their involvement in Wright's program, sought absolution through confession. Their testimonies, carefully collected by Hannah and published in small, independent newspapers, sparked investigations that reached as far as Washington. Though many officials denied knowledge of the experiments, the evidence became harder to ignore. Matthew discovered that his old friend John had been tracking similar stories along the northern trade routes, documenting cases of missing people and suspicious military movements. They began corresponding through encrypted messages, building a detailed map of government activities that seemed to follow the major waterways, using river commerce as cover for their operations. The seasons turned, and the landscape around Laredo transformed as more displaced tribes found refuge there. What began as a temporary sanctuary evolved into a thriving community, one that honored both traditional ways and new alliances. Grace's people shared their agricultural knowledge with other tribes, while river traders brought news and necessary supplies, creating an economy independent of government oversight. Matthew never regained full use of his injured leg, but he found unexpected peace in this new role as teacher and protector. The skills that had once served him in hunting bounties now helped ensure the safety of an entire community. He often thought about the moment he'd found Grace, how close he'd come to walking away, and how that single choice had altered so many lives. The river itself seemed to guard their secrets, its waters carrying away traces of the past while nourishing new growth along its banks. The children who had survived Wright's experiments grew stronger, their unique abilities becoming gifts rather than burdens. They learned to use their enhanced senses to protect their people, turning what was meant to harm them into a source of strength. As autumn returned, bringing cool winds down from the north, Matthew received word that the last of Wright's research facilities had been abandoned. The program, exposed to public scrutiny, collapsed under the weight of its own darkness. But the network they'd built, of tribes, traders, and truth-seekers, remained, a testament to the power of unlikely alliances forged in the face of evil. Grace's final victory came not through violence but through preservation. She gathered the stories of survivors, recording them in both tribal tradition and written word, ensuring that future generations would understand both the darkness they'd faced and the light they'd found in each other. The rivers that had once carried soldiers now carried these stories, flowing ever onward, unchanged by the ambitions of men who sought to control them.